Okay, so we have a few people watching this live streaming. This will be a live streaming about GDPR. It's a 30-minute presentation we use for our organization, and I'm hoping that by sharing it, it will also help you. There will be some resources at the end, and I encourage you to check them out after this presentation. Also, if you have any questions, just write them in the chat on the right side, and I will try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Before we move on, I want to make a big disclaimer. This guide is purely for guidance and does not constitute legal advice or legal analysis. Organizations may need to seek independent legal advice for specific legal issues or queries. Okay. So why am I holding this presentation? My name is Claudiu. I'm a digital marketer here at Themeisle, and I was involved in researching the responsibilities of an organization in respect with the General Data Protection Regulation. What I realized after starting to do the research is that GDPR has a severe PR problem, from the dominating narrative around the fines to the unlimited options about how to implement it. To complicate matters even more, the people who wrote the law weren't necessarily tech gurus, nor could they foresee edge cases where the law and reality don't align. The EU created GDPR in an effort to protect digital identities of its citizens by making companies liable for data being used without customers' consent. So, why does GDPR matter for all of us? Okay, some people continued, some people joined the chat, so you can leave there any questions. And let's get back to the question I was asking before. Why does GDPR matter for all of us? Some consultants we talked to say that there's no such thing as being 100% GDPR compliant. It's more about taking a look at data and processes from an ethical standpoint and not as much about tools or checklists. So my recommendation will be to not search for a template. Each organization has its own way of doing things. Try for yourself to develop efficient data protection and privacy strategy based on your own scenario. This is why this guide is just a starting point with a high-level and general approach. Ideally, you will need to dig into each area of your business and look at how you collect, process, disclose, store, and delete data. Okay, so here are some things to consider before we move on to more practical aspects and how to comply with GDPR. I just want to mention the scope of GDPR. This is actually just an evolution, not necessarily something new for the not even for Europeans, also for worldwide. Data protection is something that has come in the news for quite some time. This is why there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. And the most important thing from my perspective is that employees must have a privacy mindset. Just remember that 40% of the data breaches are have internal factors, not necessarily external factors. So hacking and stuff like that is just almost half of the problems that we have with data. This is why the scope of GDPR is just to refresh and redefine some privacy notices that we had before. It's not necessarily something new. So what is the big fuss? Why is GDPR going to affect us in the end? Definitely it would take some time to understand the regulation, but it depends on the nature of your organization and how you handle personal data. So there are always risks when you process personal data, but it depends on the amount you process, collect, and store, the sensitivity of the data, and stuff like that. What you can do for your organization is to have a proactive attitude. By that I mean just notify people about how important privacy is and stuff like that. Okay, so if the things are almost the same, what is changing and why? Well, the thing is that I think there are only a few situations where businesses don't process information at all. In most cases, there are different levels of key personnel that interact with customer data, like HR, IT, marketing, security teams, support teams, and so on. And therefore, all of these people should be aware of the General Data Protection Regulation. This isn't a one-person show. You need both technical, legal, and the proactive attitude of the persons you work with. Okay, so the reason you should care is that the majority of the EU states will consider sanctions for the companies that disregard this regulation. You can be quite good for some time if you don't want to be compliant with GDPR, but the potential fines, if this will reach a point where authorities will give fines to the companies, will probably be bad for business. And in the end, is the right thing to do. Think about this as how you would like for your personal data to be handled. We should all care about privacy in the end. But the thing that I saw while doing in my research is that a lot of people focus on online. But being GDPR compliant is not just about fixing a website. It's part of an entire company, an entire organization. So, what are the first things you can do to better understand what is all this fuss about GDPR? The first step is to understand the terms. Take some time to look at the glossary that you'll find in the resources at the end of the presentation, and try to understand what the data subject means, data controller, personal data, what's the real definition of personal data, what's a data processor. This will help you understand this guide. This will help you understand other articles. In the end, it will help you understand better understand the law. The reason I listed here the data subject rights is that everybody should know that on top of the rights that data subjects have, there are also some obligations. If you look at them, there are quite a lot. This is why I encourage you to look at them on the recording that you will have. Excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. I got a cold, and this is the best I've got with my voice right now. So I was saying that on top of the rights that everybody is talking about, there are some obligations. So data controllers and data processors should consider this when they use personal data. Okay. So there are two main. There's the timeline divides between two big parts. So there's the time before 25th of May, which is the date when GDPR comes into force, and it's the time after 25th of May when the GDPR is in force and the law has taken full effects. Here are some recommendations that you should take before the deadline. First of all, consider doing a data mapping. This is an important step towards compliance with GDPR, because it's important to understand how data move in your organization. Documenting the way information flows in your company by making an inventory helps you demonstrate that you comply. I have a good resource that I will share with you, the link. You basically can see it in the image. By having this flow all mapped up, you can understand where the risks are and what you need to improve. Another important aspect that you should definitely do before 25th of May is the privacy policy. Um, Even if you have one, you should review it and update it with your current with the current details. That GDPR need to comply. So you need to review it with the latest GDPR regulations. This must be, it's a best practice to communicate this to individuals, to let them know about why you process data, what is your retention period, and so on. But after you do this, try to look at some internal training. This is available for all businesses. Even though if you are not in Europe, you should know about GDPR or have at least a general idea about how we look at personal data here. So, what are the steps to take after the deadline? Basically, I think you just need to remember that personal data is not a commodity, and more than that, is not a free commodity. It's not something that it's something that we took for granted for so long, but now the importance of data is higher than ever, and I think you should uh, think of that before you do anything with the data that you collect from your users or customers. Because in the end, this is just not just about GDPR, it's about your brand. Yeah, I'm sorry for the coughing. I think that it will get better by the end of the presentation. Hopefully, I could answer the questions at the end. Okay, so here are some action steps you can take even after the deadline. Always check what other vendors are doing in your market. Right now, GDPR has no clear-cut rules, so the market is still adapting with different tactics, and so on. A lot of companies are coming out with new features, even this week before the deadline. So be sure to check competitor websites for changes and best practices. One important thing we should do, we should all do after and before, we should have done before the deadline, is to report data breaches. It is known that some of the data breaches, the most known data breaches, just came into the public knowing after somebody asked questions for that company, or even years after it happened. Right now, there's a technical obligation to inform the supervisory authority and the persons that were affected within 72 hours after a data breach. Another thing you should consider after the deadline is that operational policies, procedure, and processes should be a continuous work. This is not a one-time project. You are not GDPR compliant and you finish the work. You have to look all the time on how to improve the security of your products, the security of your devices you are using within your company, and so on. Okay, most of us have websites, either personal or company websites. So this is why the majority of the articles cover the website adjustments you should make after GDPR comes into force. From my research, what I've understood is that consent is probably the biggest thing regarding being GDPR compliant with your website. There are two main aspects. So there are opt-in forms. This is the standard way, I should say, how businesses gather information. Either there's a contact form, an opt-in form for a newsletter, and so on. And another way we interact with users is by placing a cookie when they come to our website to either improve their experience or retarget them via marketing purposes, and so on. So just to consider, when you have opt-in forms, you should demonstrate, you should have proof of consent This is a slide where I go into more details about consent, and I recommend to read it after the presentation is done, just to have a better understanding how you should prove consent, how is it's necessarily to inform the users about the cookie that we place and so on. Of course, on top of the website, there are some other aspects regarding GDPR, because again, GDPR is not online only. GDPR is also for the offline world. We live in a world where everything goes online, but this is not the only way to take care of our customers or users' personal data. Here are some general things that you should look into. For example, that data transfer is a big thing. The regulation says that the data should be stored in the country of its origin. So, for example, in the European Union, you cannot transfer personal data outside of European Union without the user consent. Also, for the personal data that is sensitive, like race, religion, and so on, you should organizations should have a data protection impact assessment. This is a whole new level of complexity, but it's something to consider. Another thing that practitioners, that privacy specialists refer to, are legitimate interest assessments. Legitimate interest is a way to prove that you have the right to collect and use the personal data of the users. And by having this document, have a document where you explain what is your legitimate interest to have a personal data and stuff like that, is a way to demonstrate for the supervisory authorities that you comply. Another big discussion is about data protection officers. So the organization require DPOs, data protection officers, for public authorities, organizations whose activities involve regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, or organizations that process what is currently known as sensitive personal data. This is on the side pretty clear. On the other side, the regulation doesn't define what large scale means, so there's still some controversy here. But for now, I don't think that DPOs are required in all the companies. Also, another thing that I didn't see mentioned that much is about processing children's data. So if your organization processes data from underage subjects, that means under 16 years old, you must ensure that you have adequate systems in place to verify individual ages and gather consent from their parents, for example. GDPR has some specific provisions for children under 16 years old. There's an article on that. I recommend to read it and understand it for the best of your abilities. Another thing that GDPR talks about is privacy by design. So this is referring to more of for the developer people out there, is a way to look at how you build things. So privacy by design just means that you should be transparent with users and take a proactive approach when looking at privacy. So this means that you should build your product with privacy in mind. This is the simplest definition that you should have in mind. For example, here are some questions you should ask yourself if you develop WordPress plugins. What personal data does this plugin collect? This is the first question, of course. Like, does it collect any personal data? If it doesn't, that doesn't mean you shouldn't build something that has privacy in mind first. But first of all, does it collect data? Why? Why do you need that data? Do you collect it with a legitimate interest? Do you have consent from the users? Is this data passed to third parties? So is this data moved around between your servers and another company, and so on? What personal data is stored on the database and remotely? These are some of the things that a developer should know better. These are some okay. So here are some examples for the that we took and we looked at regarding our websites and products. Excuse me. Okay, we are back, hopefully without coughing. Okay, so here are some technical examples for the developers. This is just a small list. You should look at it at just as examples. Here are some other examples about how you should consider privacy by design. For example, when you build a product, you should implement user opt-in mechanism from the beginning. You should log the consent. That means for that user, you should have a way to export the moment when he or she gave you consent to collect the personal data, and so on. Probably the most important thing here is the data export tool. This is a tool that will let your users port their data from one provider to another. Okay, so the last thing you should consider, the last thing that I looked in my research is the fact that after all this, you should always monitor and audit your personal data. In the end, just think that there are different levels of compliance, and you should decide which one fits your purpose based on a lot more factors than the ones listed here or that I mentioned. However, probably if you have a way to log the consent of the users, you have a clear privacy policy that explains how you collect data, how you store it, how you process it, and how you delete it, you are probably 80% safe until more guides come from the European Union regarding how to better implement GDPR. So that being said, just acknowledge as an organization, as an individual, as an employee, as a freelancer, as whatever you are, that being transparent about how that data is used and protected is now required by law. So transparency has a big place with GDPR. Each organization must define a scope for which they collect specific data. Another big thing is to keep the data safe. Okay, not everything, not like impenetrable, but just have procedures in place to audit your security, your websites, and so on. Okay, so this will be my presentation. I think that if I will stop now, my coughing will not kill me, hopefully. Here are some general information related to the GDPR. I will link to them in the recording of this video. And I will look at the chat to see if there are any questions. Okay, so no questions. That being said, I think we can stop now. And after this video is being processed, it will be available on the channel. And if you have any more questions, I will gladly respond to them in the comment sections. Goodbye.